Entre Arquitectas, encontrando nuestra voz.
Hola, bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides a un nuevo episodio de Entre Arquitectas. Yo soy Lu y estoy aquí con Ángela y con Ari, listas para estrenar este nuevo episodio. ¿Cómo están?
Muy feliz de estar acá. Ari, ¿tú cómo estás?
La verdad que muy contenta y muy emocionada. Tenemos que contarles que este episodio es especial. Forma parte del experimento que quisimos hacer para esta temporada. Estamos muy satisfechas, aunque nos costó y hicimos todo el mejor esfuerzo y seguramente habrá mucho más para avanzar, pero les compartimos un remoto con unas características muy especiales.
Pues el episodio está en inglés porque Mayu vive en Estados Unidos, pero es originaria de Japón, entonces pues el español no se cruzó en su vida. Es justamente esta búsqueda que queremos hacer en esta nueva temporada de salirnos del territorio mexicano y explorar nuevas maneras de cómo se hace arquitectura en el extranjero. Y pues Mayu fue una invitada excepcional, entonces pues es un episodio excepcional.
Y para que no se pierdan este episodio tan diferente, si alguien cree que es necesario, los invitamos a que nos sigan en YouTube. En YouTube pueden encontrar este episodio y todos los demás con subtítulos y transcripción para que los puedan seguir más fácilmente.
Pues bueno, estamos listas. Mayu Uchiyama es arquitecta con formación interdisciplinaria en artes escénicas y diseño espacial. Estudió en la University of Redlands School of Performing Arts y en Miami University, donde participó en el Opera Theater con papeles protagónicos, integrando cuerpo, narrativa y espacio en su visión del diseño.
Mayu posteriormente continuó su formación en la Spitzer School of Architecture del City College of New York, donde ha profundizado en los vínculos entre sonido, percepción sensorial y espacio urbano. Ella ha participado en proyectos como The Body's Space o Life and Death in Louisiana. Investiga el habitar desde la memoria, el cuerpo y la dimensión simbólica del territorio.
Su práctica combina instalación, análisis urbano, dibujo y pensamiento crítico. Trabaja desde la escala doméstica hasta la territorial, proponiendo una arquitectura expandida desde una mirada sensible y experimental.
Estamos muy contentas de este episodio.
Muchas gracias por estar acá y vamos a escuchar lo que Mayu tiene que decirnos.
Estás escuchando Entre Arquitectas.
Hi, Mayu. We are so happy to have you here. It's like a dream come true because you're like one of my favorite persons in the world. So I'm very happy to have you here. And we wanted to start this small interview asking you to tell us like who you are. So my name is Mayu Uchiyama. And I just graduated with Master's of Architecture 1 degree from the City College of New York. Prior to the Master's of Architecture, I graduated with a Master's of Music in Vocal Performance. And then before that, I graduated from the University of Redlands, which is in LA, with a Bachelor's of Music. So before my 3-year degree, I studied opera for about 10 years. After the kind of my operatic journey, I realized that I felt really limited in just music, and I felt my means of expression and my means of creativity wasn't just music. It needed to be music and something else. And through just kind of talking to people and speaking with the people around me and getting to know more people around me and expanding that circle, I ended up kind of meeting architecture. And through that, I decided to come to New York because before I studied architecture, I was talking to a lot of people who were in the field, and they recommended that I study in a place where I want to learn the city. And so I decided that New York, I was actually going back and forth in Chicago and New York, but I decided on New York because I've always been fascinated by the city. My best friend has been living here, and so she has introduced me to the city on a few occasions, but I was like, I want to study architecture and I want to study New York with architecture. So that's why I'm here.
Mayu nos platica cómo la música fue su primer lenguaje y también el punto de partida para descubrir la arquitectura. Y nos contó que ella quería vivir en una ciudad de la que pudiera aprender y por eso eligió Nueva York para establecerse. Queríamos saber también cómo es crecer entre Japón y Estados Unidos y cómo es para ella vivir entre arquitectura y música. Y al menos personalmente me encanta lo que nos cuenta de cómo el idioma se vuelve una frontera y un puente al mismo tiempo.
I moved from Japan when I was 3 years old. And so for me, being bilingual was definitely had its perks But also I did find myself kind of struggling with that as I grew up because my my first language was Japanese and I was learning English. And every summer I would go back to my grandmother's house to spend time with my family and kind of reestablish my Japaneseness and understand where I came from. And so through that back and forth, language was actually something I found very, very difficult. Like there were certain things that I can say in Japanese, but I couldn't express it in English or vice versa. And then for me, music actually became kind of a really parallel or a language that kind of united the two because I could, sing a song in French. I could sing a chanson or I could sing, an aria or a German Lieder. And through that, I knew the translation but I understood that people who didn't know the language could still understand what I was expressing or could understand what the song was about. And so that language essentially kind of became the focal point for me. And so that allowed me to kind of go back and forth between English and Japanese and kind of finding this kind of parallel. And, opera is a very, very Western art form. And so for me, it was definitely difficult, but I did find that there were certain things that my Japanese language and the pronunciation and stuff actually seemed a little bit closer to Italian or something. So I found kind of ways that it kind of paralleled for me. And then I think architecture actually is more the opposite. I think with music was kind of the central, and then I could go Japan and I could go United States or America. But with architecture, I kind of find myself looking at Western architecture and Japanese architecture. And then I am finding myself through the two instead of, being on the other way around. So that kind of allowed me to, I guess, in a sense, become who I am and express my uniqueness, which I think was one thing that was missing a little bit with just studying music was I felt like I was in between, but I couldn't really do both. But now that I have this kind of outside in with architecture, I'm finding a way to express both inwardly and outwardly.
Para Mayu, viajar a Japón cada verano significaba no solo cambiar de país, sino también de idioma. Ella encontró en la música un lenguaje que le permitía conectar desde la emoción. De la misma forma en su trabajo, el sonido y el dibujo se entrelazan como dos lenguajes para pensar el espacio. Nosotras escuchamos su voz moverse entre dos mundos, como quien traduce, no con palabras, sino con emoción.
I decided, maybe going a little bit on the tangent, but one of the reasons that I decided to study at the City College of New York was there were a couple of, I was fortunate to get several other, application and acceptances from other schools. But City College was essentially starting this new program where they were studying architecture with some other language. It could be the architecture and the study of the human body. Another year I studied architecture and the military industrial complex, form and architecture. So there's always this idea of architecture and something else. All architecture and culture, architecture and something. And so that allowed me to have my Japaneseness, also my musical background to actually be a plus rather than a deficit, and my lack of architecture being a hindrance. So because this program kind of implemented that kind of system, I decided to go to this school because it allowed me to do both. And actually, I found that whenever I could speak the music, I could explain music in an architectural language. That's when I found myself the most. And I was fortunate to have professors that really encouraged that, where when they could see the music in my architecture, or when they can understand the language that I'm speaking, which when I'm explaining music, but they understand it because I'm actually translating it to an architectural language. For me, I think I really associate with sound, just I think from my background and my training. So whenever I see architecture, I see I see a space where if I visit a site, the first thing I do is I actually record the sounds. I record the sounds, and through those sounds, they essentially kind of develop like a notational system. And through those notational systems, I can essentially my means of measuring those sounds. And I'm measuring the sounds in the space that I've heard. And that's my kind of focus, my primary kind of go-to in terms of understanding a neighborhood, a building. Whenever I see a structural framework, I do see it in music in a way. And I, sometimes look at weird, an old building where the construction is all sorts of craziness, which happens a lot in New York. And I see that, and I see it almost as like a dissonant. It's like two, very unusual, not very clear space. It's very spatial, but that also becomes very musical to me. And so I do think that, while I'm still developing and I do think I have a lot to learn in terms of understanding architectural intellectually, there's that kind of intuition or that gut feeling that's very, very musical and also just it's very oral to me.
La arquitectura apareció en su vida como un segundo idioma, un lenguaje que no reemplazó la música, sino que la amplificó. Escuchar un edificio, grabar los sonidos de un lugar para entenderlo. Esa es una de las ideas más bellas de esta charla, que el oído también diseña. La arquitectura, dice Mayu, puede comenzar con un sonido.
That makes me remind about how we work in Fontainebleau. We made like this project. I was telling Ari and Angela that we had, proposed like a new way of making a garden. So we made like a certain critique about like these very perfect gardens of French gardens and English gardens. So I remember like the creativity of Mayu of doing like these things. Like it was so crazy. Like we started like working from a leaf of a tree and it was like amazing. So I wanted to ask you, well, maybe a more personal question, but like, do you, after coming back of Fontainebleau, did you change like a little bit your way of working in New York? Or I understand that you have a work in New York. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, or how's your experience working there? For me, like, I think my program from Fontainebleau was actually like both positive, but also there was a little bit of a negative because Fontainebleau was this magical place where I was like in a dream, like every time we just went to the jardin and just hung out, or we got to like just see the chateau, like, and also just being immersed in so much history. And so that, in a sense, when I came back to New York, I think I was still in dreamland. And then when I came back to school, and I was like, I just want to paint watercolors. I want to just paint like beautiful facades of buildings that I noticed. And so there was a little bit of myself that needed to kind of wake up, especially in New York, where it's like, come on, let's get going. So there was a little bit of like a jolt or a startle when I came back here. But I will say observation to detail was something that I think with, the project that I did with Lou, with just looking at every vein of a leaf, and then also like being inspired by other classmates and seeing their work and seeing how detail oriented they are. And essentially, I think it kind of enabled us, it at least enabled myself to be okay with this form of self-expression and understanding all of us have our own way of going about and discovering, learning, and creating and designing. I think having just been focused on architecture and, my education has been centered around New York and City College of New York students. And so then going to Fontainebleau and meeting people from Mexico and, meeting people from all over the world allowed me to understand that there's so many different ways of thinking. And that actually is more interesting to me. I think kind of intellectually and kind of observational wise, it heightened my skills. But again, I did come back from dreamland and I needed to wake up a little bit. And that took a little bit of time. But I will say like, it was a precious moment in my life to be able to, again, meet people and understand how people think architecturally outside of New York and Japan.
Para Mayu, el intercambio en Francia fue un sueño lúcido que la volvió más atenta. Entre jardines, historia y el ritmo pausado del dibujo a mano, descubrió una libertad nueva para observar cada detalle, la estructura de una hoja, la naturaleza, las miradas diversas de sus compañeros de varios rincones del mundo. Un espacio de encuentro entre lo manual y lo poético. Escucharla hablar del dibujo es escuchar la voz de alguien que piensa con la mano.
Oh, I forgot to mention, one thing that I loved about Fontainebleau actually was the hand drawings. I grew up with hand drawings. I loved to draw. My education, I went to Waldorf education, but that is really centered around learning through experience. So instead of having textbooks, we actually were drawing and writing. And in the end, we had our own textbooks that we created out of what we learned. And so it was very, very hands-on. So that was something that I've known ever since I was a little kid. And honestly, I think I was interested in architecture in high school, but I knew that it was becoming very, very digital. And so I was actually apprehensive, but decided to let that go and move into architecture. But I started architecture in fall of 2020. So this was in the midst of COVID. So my first year was all through Zoom. Everything was Zoom. We would be on 9-hour Zoom meetings, sharing our screen. So everything was through Rhino, Adobe, Photoshop, Illustrator, and there was nothing physical. So we never really did anything by hand, besides maybe like the teacher would sketch something and show up something on the screen. And then the second year, we were kind of still in COVID too. So first 2 years, 2 of the 3 years of my architecture was all digital. And then having gone to Fontainebleau, where there was no computers and everything was hand-drawn, that allowed me to actually push myself and learn architecture via pen and paper, which is something I've always wanted to do. And so that also was actually a dream come true. So that being said, I will say that's something that I cherish. And this year, I pretty much only did hand drawings. And because I loved the thought process, I loved that feeling of pen and paper. I could just draw lines on a piece of paper for hours and hours and hours. And that's actually what my project ended up becoming. But that process is something that I really cherish. And so, moving forward and as I kind of continue on my architectural endeavor, I am very, very interested in keeping that and looking for a firm that still kind of cherishes that idea of even the thought, thinking via hand drawings or scribbling on trace paper. And that's actually one of my main things that I'm looking for in a firm that moving on. And the firm that I work at now does it, but I am thinking of expanding in a few months and going into a larger firm. But that pen and paper relationship is something I'm really looking for.
Después de 2 años de Zoom, de Rhino, de pantallas y renders en plena pandemia, volver al lápiz y al papel no fue solo un método, fue un regreso a sí misma. Fue recordar que puede pensar dibujando, que hay ideas que solo aparecen cuando la mano toca el papel. Ahora sueña con un despacho que valore ese gesto. Ya sabes, la línea, el trazo, el rastro de la tinta como forma de pensamiento. En fin, aprovechamos para preguntarle a Mayu qué quiere decirle a ustedes que nos escuchan.
Especially with my musical background, when there is an audience, when there is someone to share my story in front of, it's always, I could never take that for granted, whether it's, a small living room or a huge auditorium. I think storytelling is just so fascinating, so beautiful. And so I am just excited and thank you. And I look forward to hearing everyone else's stories too. So I think from a young age, I'm always fascinated with storytelling. I loved fairy tales. And I remember when I was walking in Japan and I was looking around and I realized, I was like, everybody here has a background or a story that's unlike anyone else's. Everyone has a different story. And so I think just having a platform to share is always incredible. And yeah, I look forward to hearing other people's stories as well.
A continuación, Mayu nos cuenta los viajes de verano y el paisaje que la formó. Volver a la casa de su abuela en Yokohama, a sus orígenes.
My association to Japan is Yokohama. I was born there. It's in Kanagawa. If you know the Hokusai, the huge wave print, that's from the Bay of Kanagawa. And so that's where I was essentially born. And so I actually moved to Hyogo, which is closer to Hiroshima, when I was 6 months before I moved to the United States due to my father's work. But for me, Japan equals Yokohama because my grandmother on my mother's side lives there. And every year I used to visit every summer. And so she actually lives very, very close to one of the main stations in Yokohama. It's just one train ride and I can actually go visit the city of Yokohama. And so I was actually exposed to the city of Yokohama. And then every now and then my father would take me to, Shinjuku or Ginza, Tokyo. And, so I do have a touch of that. But that Tokyo and Kanagawa are probably the two prefectures that I definitely associate to and kind of draw, that's where I go. I've actually never really vacationed in Japan before. Like, I think going to Japan equals going to see my family. And so we never were people who like adventured everywhere. So you are correct. When I think of Japan, I think of a very specific spot in Japan, so great food, amazing. To me, it's almost like Chicago compared to New York. Or, if it's like New York and Chicago, it's a little bit more like Chicago because it's a little bit smaller. It's a little bit cleaner than Ginza, Tokyo, or Shibuya or something. It's not as hectic, but there is a good population. I was exposed to a little bit more of the city life, or maybe a little bit more of the urban life, not necessarily the countryside or the hills.
I learning a lot of things about Mayu too. Yeah, so it's amazing. Preguntamos a Mayu sobre sus influencias femeninas tanto en la música como en la arquitectura, y nos habla de las mujeres que le inspiran, profesoras, amigas, artistas, y reconoce la fuerza que nace del encuentro con otras mujeres.
Honestly, maybe my closest friends. Honestly, I was trying to think of maybe like someone famous or someone that people know, but I get so much inspiration from my friends. And I am fortunate to know so many incredible women, and Lou is one of them. Like their talents is just mind-blowing, and kind of I'm fascinated by them, but also like not only that, but I have the privilege to have a conversation with them. Like I think that is maybe like my biggest inspirations. And I have professors that I have met. I will say one name. Her name is Anna Bokov. Dr. Anna Bokov, excuse me. She is an architect, but she's also primarily focused on art historian. And she's Russian, but her research recently, she's actually published a book about Voludmas, which is essentially the Russian Bauhaus. So her knowledge and her demeanor, everything about her, I admired so much. And then Lou's also an inspiration to me. There's some incredible women that I've met at Fontainebleau that I still think about the work that they did, and that still kind of like it's a little, a little bit of firewood for my flame, and definitely keeps me going. And even people who aren't necessarily in the field of architecture, but music. Oh my gosh, I can think of so many amazing sopranos that have guided me through the way. And Living and Dead, Anna Moko is maybe one of my favorite soprano singers. There's something about her that I just listen to and I can just start crying. So there's so many women. There's so many women that I'm constantly inspired by. And again, I think whenever I get to talk to my closest friends and get inspired by them, I always feel so grateful that they're in my life, and I somehow made my way to being part of theirs, and I'm proud of it.
Thank you, Mayu. You're also an inspiration for me every day. Thank you so much. This made me so happy just to see you want to talk about who you are. That it always amazed me, like the person you are and all the things you do, that it's just amazing. So yeah, thank you so much for being here and for accepting this interview. We are so happy to have you.
Entre Arquitectas.
Bueno, chicas, pues hemos llegado al final. No sé qué les pareció Lu y Ángela, y muchas gracias a quien nos haya acompañado hasta este momento. Por mi parte, emocionante este episodio bilingüe.
Sí, creo que además los temas de los que nos habla Mayu en el episodio se prestan muy bien a que sea justo el experimento bilingüe. Entonces, emocionadas, ¿no? ¿Tú qué piensas, Lu?
Sí, la verdad, yo admiro mucho a Mayu porque tenemos algo en común, que es relacionar la arquitectura y la música. Es por eso que la conozco. Y pues me emociona mucho escucharla y conocer su punto de vista acerca de estos dos temas. Y pues sin más, para el próximo episodio vamos a presentarles a Lourdes Pérez. Ella es arquitecta y nos tiene temas muy emocionantes para la Ciudad de México.
Pues no se lo pierdan. Queremos también agradecerle, como siempre, a Jesús González Ponce por todo su apoyo y la producción.
A Cecilia Naya por su voz para nuestras cortinillas.
Y la hermosa música que nuestra querida Lucía nos deja para el podcast.
Y sin más, si nos quieren encontrar en redes, a mí me encuentran como @AngelaUrrutia, a mí como @lu_ram_.
A mí me encuentran como @Ariana_Arriaga. Y por favor síganos en nuestras redes como @Entre Arquitectas.
Nos vemos en el próximo episodio.
Entre Arquitectas. Encontrando nuestra voz.